Okay, the 1950s. So we've covered the first few slides of this in class, but I think we're going to pick up here. I think that's a couple of you have already done this slide, so you can skip forward if you have. So one of the things we're really going to look at as we get into the 1950s is the growth of the civil rights movement. Now, taking a quick look back at the situation in the South, right, things aren't great. Jim Crow laws are still in effect. It's illegal for black people to play checkers at the same table as white people, to share taxi cabs, to be buried in the same graveyards, all varying county to county, but almost every single southern state has required Jim Crow laws, required segregation laws in place. But one of the things that's interesting is as we move further into the 1950s, we're really going to see the civil rights movement develop and take place. And there's reasons why it starts when it does. So one of the biggest things that we see is the Second Great Migration. Right, similar to when the First Great Migration happened during World War I and then led into the Harlem Renaissance, with the Second Great Migration in World War II, we see millions of people leaving the South and moving to northern cities or western cities. And one of the things that they're realizing is, not only is treatment better, not, when I knew that, but they're able to speak out without fear of retaliation for the first time. And that's going to be a really big deal. So people will be able to speak more freely about what they had been experiencing, the level of discrimination, the level of terror that they were living under in the southern states. And so the movement's going to be able to develop through that. One of the other big things that takes place is we have men returning from war. And they'd been fighting overseas in segregated units, but part of with returning from war, again, just like we saw in World War I, people start seeing the disparity of what we had been fighting for and the ideals of, taking down fascism and fighting for equality and preventing racial segregation and all of that. But we still see all of this segregation and all of this discrimination taking place in the United States. So we start once again talking about what we call double victory, or the double V, right? Victory over dictators abroad, and then victory over racism back home. And so we're going to see this really lead into and ramp up the civil rights movement as well. Now, one major trend that I want you guys to pay attention to as we move through the civil rights movement is the role of media. Right? Media is going to become incredibly important. We will see images and videos of some of the horrible things being done published throughout the country for the first time, and that's going to, force people who lived in different areas who didn't either necessarily believe that things were as bad as they were or pay attention to the level of how bad things were, and now they're sort of being forced to look at it as it spreads. So one of the major cases that's incredibly tragic, but that sort of pushes this forward, is the case of Emmett Till. And we know vigilantism and acts of violence were very common throughout the South. And we've talked about this as we went through Reconstruction and then with the second wave of the Klan in the 20s. But one of the focuses was really on trying to punish people where it was perceived that they'd stepped out of their quote-unquote place in society, right? And so trying to maintain order through the system of terror. So in the case of Emmett Till, he's a 14-year-old kid from Chicago, and he lived there with his mother. But he went down to Mississippi, the Delta region of Mississippi, which is the deep South, for the summer to stay with his grandmother. And his mom had warned him, things aren't quite the same down there as they are up here. And he, spent part of the summer down there having a wonderful time. And one day he walks into a little convenience store to buy some candy, I think, with some cousins, and allegedly while he was in there, he had whistled at the white woman behind the counter. Now, in her trial, or in the trial, she's going to come out and she says he was sexually aggressive towards me and he was threatening me, and she actually just came out this year or last fall and said it's all fake and I made all of that part up. But allegedly, he whistles at her, and when this word of this gets around town, her husband and a couple of his friends decide that they need to teach this, uppity kid a lesson. And so they break into his grandmother's house and kidnap him, and they spend hours beating and torturing him in one of their barns before finally shooting him and tossing him into the Tallahassee River with a 75-pound cotton gin fan tied to his neck with barbed wire. When his body was recovered 3 days later, he was so badly beaten that many of the bones in his face had been broken. He had burn marks and cut marks all over his body. One of his eyes had been gouged out. All of this because he allegedly whistled at someone. And what his mother does now is actually really important in terms of the wider scheme of this. But his mom demands that his body be sent back to her as is. And she gets help of the NAACP, I think, and some other organizations to ensure that his body gets sent back without being cremated, because she wanted to see her son. And when his body arrives back north, what she does is she actually holds an open casket. Most people, you hold an open casket if if your face is still preserved or people can see you as is or whatever, but you'd close caskets with, so people didn't have to see what you looked like when you died, which is, sort of a natural human reaction. But she held an open casket and a public funeral. So thousands of people came by over a 2-day period to pay their respects to Emmett and to look at his face and to look at what had happened to him for something so ridiculous. And pictures of his face were taken and published in newspapers that began getting spread throughout the country. And so his story ended up getting spread everywhere, and that's going to play a huge role in starting to force people to pay attention, right? And be like, oh my God, how could this happen? This is such an insanely tragic story. And on top of that, the men went on trial, but of course they were on trial in front of an all-white jury, hearing these false accounts that he had been sexually aggressive and threatening to this woman. And within an hour, Emmett Till's killers were fully acquitted and walked free. So this is the type of thing that's taking place in the South, which makes sense why we're finally really wanting to push for change here. So what this map shows is educational segregation in the United States. This is right before Brown versus Board gets passed through. So all of the red states there are states that required educational segregation, meaning you must segregate education. All of the yellow states don't have any legislation about it. So basically, it's left up to county by county, or it could be integrated. They just don't really say anything about it on a statewide level. The blue states are optional or limited, where they actually have state laws saying, we can segregate some people and not others, or we're doing it in limited areas, or maybe in these schools but not these schools, or we'll leave it up to the counties. And then the green states have forbidden segregation. Now, all of this is going to change with Brown versus Board of Education, which takes place in 1954. Now, this is a court case I've mentioned before, and you guys should maybe be familiar with the name. But Brown versus Board of Education is going to seek to challenge the idea of separate but equal, right? Of the idea that there are equal and separate facilities, which of course is absurd. And that had been put in place by Plessy versus Ferguson, if we remember back to that court case. In 1896. So this is seeking to overturn that decision, that separate but equal is legal and constitutional. So it starts in 1951 as a class action lawsuit filed against the Board of Education in the city of Topeka. And the plaintiffs were 13 different Topeka parents on behalf of their 20 children. But the named plaintiff is a man named Oliver Brown. And he worked for a welder for the Santa Fe Railroad Company and was studying to be a minister. His daughter, Linda, was a third grader, and she had to walk 6 blocks to her school bus stop to ride to Monroe Elementary, which was her segregated black school about a mile away. Yet, Sumner Elementary, a white school, was only 7 blocks from her house. She could have just walked there rather than having to catch the bus. The NAACP is absolutely going to be a part of this. They recruited Oliver Brown, and they helped to try to set this up. And so her parents, Linda's parents, tried to enroll their kids in the closest neighborhood in the fall of 1951. Of course, they were denied, and so when they were denied, they sue. And they go through this whole process, and they say it's unconstitutional for us to have this happen. So the district court rules in favor of the board, right, the local court, and they say, no, it's totally okay, citing the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson, but they had planned for that. So they are going to appeal that decision, and eventually it will make it to the Supreme Court. So The presiding judge in the Supreme Court at this time was Justice Earl Warren. He was the Chief Justice, and he had been a Republican governor of California. He was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower to actually be economically and socially conservative, but he turns out to be one of our more socially conscious justices, and he will enact some major legislation. Thurgood Marshall is going to be the chief counsel for the Browns, so he's arguing in favor of desegregating, essentially, saying that segregation is a violation of their rights, and the courts will agree with him. So on May 17th of 1954, in a 9-0 decision, which is huge, right? Unanimous decision, the court decides that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Now, one of the important things to remember about this too is this does not give any timeline, right? This does not immediately end segregation. It does not say all schools must be desegregated within the next 5 years. It just says it is unequal. It is not okay. It is no longer constitutional. And so we're going to have to see sort of states and counties go one by one to try to do this. But this opens the door to get rid of segregation across the board, which is part of why it's so significant. It's really sort of it paves the way for everything else to be changed after this. Now, one of the other really tricky aspects here is even though you pass this, right, you can't pass a law that ends racism. You can't legally make someone not be racist, right, not have their thoughts or feelings or whatever. And that's hard because there's going to be a lot of pushback and resistance to this, and it's hard to enforce it. So this is going to become the next major decision. How do we enforce this, and are we willing to use the federal government's power to do so? Final note about Brown versus Board, one of the important things that the NAACP did when trying to find a court case that was appropriate here is they wanted to make sure that the case that they were tackling was two equal schools. So the black school that Linda could have gone to was a well-funded school, but they wanted to make sure that the courts didn't say, well, let's just give the schools more funding. Right? They wanted to make sure that the decision was on the basis of separate but equal is unconstitutional, right? You cannot have that, not just like, let's fund it more. We are going to see a continuing trend of segregation and then an attempt to desegregate as we move into looking at the Montgomery bus boycott. So the Montgomery bus boycott is going to be kickstarted by Rosa Parks, right? So we'll look at that in just a second. But in order to understand that, we have to understand how the bus system worked in Montgomery. So the way that this worked is that in each bus, the first 4 rows of bus seats were reserved for white people. And buses had colored sections in the back. Now, African Americans made up more than 75% of the bus system's riders. So the majority of the people riding the buses are black, and they generally were supposed to sit near the rear of the bus. But one of the big issues that would come up is this divider could move. There was no fixed section, right? The sections were not fixed. So the divider would start by being right behind, those first 4 rows. But as more white people got on, they would just move the divider back further and further. So that means if you were a black person sitting in the 5th row and you had been on the bus before anyone else had gone on there, but as soon as a white person would get on and sit in that 5th row, you would be forced to get up and move back further, right? So it forced you to stand and give up your seat for a white person taking that seat. Additionally, you also could not sit across the aisle from a white person, meaning there could be empty seats in the white section and people standing in the back of the bus. So there's a lot of problems surrounding the bus system, clearly. And when this whole bus boycott starts, the goal is really much more minor and sort of much less radical than we will see after. So we'll see the results being. So Rosa Parks is going to kickstart this by refusing to give up her seat. So December 1st, 1955, right, she sits in the appropriate section, right? She sits behind the line, but the line gets moved. And when the line gets moved, she just refuses to stand up. Now, interestingly, with Rosa Parks, too, they had actually tried this court case before. So the myth is commonly, right, she was just a tired old lady sitting on the bus and she refused to give up her seat. That's not it at all. Right, as she will say, as you can see in the quote here, she says, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired." But that's not true. I was not tired physically or no more tired than I usually was at the end of a working day. I was not old, although some people have an image of me as being old then. I was 42. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in. So she does this very much in an active process. Yeah, protest. And she was encouraged to do so by the NAACP. It was planned. Again, they had tried this once before with a woman named Claudette Colvin, and she went through the whole process. She refused to give up her seat. She was arrested for doing so. She claimed that her constitutional rights had been violated, and they had started the, sort of process to challenge that within the court system. But unfortunately for her, she got pregnant. And she got pregnant by a man who was older than her and married. And so they viewed this as a moral transgression, and all of a sudden she was an unsuitable victim, right? So they no longer went with that. They didn't want anyone to have room to criticize, right? Well, she's not a good victim because she's, had an extramarital affair. She got pregnant outside of wedlock, right? She's all of these things. The focus was supposed to be simply on this bus ride. And so they move on and they find Rosa Parks, and then they do this whole process again. Rosa Parks was considered to be a good victim. She was fashionably conservative. She seemed wise and patient and older, which sort of inflames the sense of righteousness. And that idea of her being an older lady who's just tired very much got played up because it makes her a more sympathetic victim. But it worked, right? So she's arrested for violating the Montgomery City Segregation Code. She appeals that conviction, formally challenging racial segregation laws. And this leads into the Montgomery bus boycott. The bus boycott had actually been planned before Rosa Parks' arrest, and it was planned by a man named E.D. Nixon. And Nixon was the president of the local chapter of the NAACP. They were waiting for the right person and the right case to sort of get the Black community behind her, and so this really was that. And so they were up in arms and immediately jumped into this bus boycott. Now, the Montgomery bus boycott is also partially significant because this is really the moment in which Martin Luther King steps into the spotlight, right? This is where he starts becoming the leader that he will be in the civil rights movement, as sort of the face of the civil rights movement. In the years, he's still a very young man. He's in his mid-20s by this point, and he's new to the scene, but he will very much jump on and be a clear, calm voice in this whole process. So what they did is they led a boycott. They refused to ride the buses for 382 days. Now, the part of the intent here was, right, if you can hurt the bus system monetarily, and with 75% of your riders not riding the bus anymore, that's very much going to hurt it monetarily because it becomes expensive. There's no point in, keeping the buses running anymore. And it's going to be really effective. So what they were demanding was simply a fixed dividing line for the segregation section of the buses, right? They weren't asking for full integration. They weren't asking for the buses to be completely desegregated. They just did not want the line to move anymore. That line would have meant that, if the white section was full, then whites would also have to stand. They couldn't move it back even further. What they ended up getting, though, was a full desegregation, which is really cool. Now, this is still a big deal, though, because for over a year, people are no longer riding the bus. And that means that you have to walk, or you have to find a carpool, or you have to ride a bike or something like that. And so we see over 40,000 Black commuters showing up and walking. Some people would walk as far as 20 miles. We see many people chipping in different ways. So we'll have church donations, which will donate shoes because shoes would be worn through so quickly. There'd be 10-cent cab rides, which would be like carpools that you could pay 10 cents for and get dropped off along the way. So similar to a bus, but just with cars. Sometimes white housewives would drive their domestic helpers to work and drop them off again. And so the community really shows up, and this is one of the largest and most successful mass movements against racial segregation throughout this, and it's really considered one of the first civil rights movement victories. So on June 4th of 1956, the federal courts ruled that racial segregation laws regarding buses are also unconstitutional, citing Brown versus Board, right? So again, this paved the way for so many of these other things. December 20th, 1956, the bus boycott officially ends and the city ordinance changes. Not only is it allowing, well, basically, they didn't maintain that line, right? Rather than just maintaining that and getting what they asked for, the city ordinance actually allows black bus passengers to sit anywhere. So it removes the line altogether and fully desegregates the buses, right? It's fully integrated now. This is the first civil rights movement victory, and MLK will very much rise to power as the leader of the civil rights movement and take this role on as we move forward. So, although the Supreme Court had ruled that integration should proceed, quote unquote, with all deliberate speed during Brown versus Board, the difficulty lies in two things. One, changing public thought, right? Just because the Supreme Court says something doesn't mean that everyone agrees, and just because you pass a law doesn't stop people from being racist. Now, the other problem is all deliberate speed is very vague, right? What is all deliberate speed? Is it speedy to do it in 2 years? Is it speedy to gradually do it? Well, I guess that doesn't make sense, but to do it over several years, right? 10 years? What is all deliberate speed? So there's no real timetable. It just says it should happen. It doesn't say by when. So when schools do try to start integrating, we see a lot of violence flare up. Young African Americans are forced to enter school amid whites throwing rocks, picketing, spitting on them, shouting racial slurs, right? Sometimes we'll even have like the police blocking them from trying to go to school with weapons and whatnot. And all of this tension and all this craziness is going to spark a KKK rebirth in the 1950s, right? So we'll see the rise of the Klan once again in the third wave. We also see the formation of what we call white citizens' councils, which was formed to defend segregation as the Southern way of life. It was simply a white supremacist organization that said it was protecting European American heritage from, being muddied by those of other ethnicities. In 1956, over 100 Southern and Confederate state congressmen signed something called the Southern Manifesto. And the Southern Manifesto basically vowed to resist all court-ordered integration, quote, by all lawful means. So they're basically saying, I know the federal government said we had to desegregate. I know the federal government said we had to integrate, but we aren't going to. And we are going to use every means possible to not do that. Now, Eisenhower, who's president right now, actually sort of was opposed to forced integration. He thought that it would cause too much chaos and craziness. But when the Supreme Court ruled that it should happen, he follows the orders of the court. So he says, the Supreme Court has spoken, and I am sworn to uphold the constitutional process in this country, and I will obey. So he's essentially stating, it's not what I would have done, but if you guys, are decreeing that it's unconstitutional, I will follow that, and I will uphold that. So he's really first put to the test when we get to the desegregation of Little Rock in 1957. So Little Rock is in Arkansas, and there's 9 African American students who sue for their right to attend an all-white Little Rock Central High School, right? So they say, look, the Supreme Court said this, we're going to start this process. It's going to be hectic and crazy, but we're going to sort of tackle this and take this on. We legally have the right to attend the school because of Brown versus Board. The governor of Arkansas, a guy named Orval Faubus, prevents them from attending the school, which, of course, is in defiance of the federal court order. And he actually calls in the Arkansas National Guard to support the segregationists on September 4th. So he calls in the state National Guard to block the students from attending school. So they show up, with all of these men with guns preventing them from coming in. And this made headlines. It will completely polarize the city. And there's actual violence that starts, breaking out and spitting and jeering towards all these students. As footage on TV and sort of as TV broadcasts this violence and it starts spreading throughout the country, public pressure finally will force Eisenhower to intervene. So right, remember, this is once again, we're seeing the role that the media plays in enacting change during civil rights. So as people are seeing images of these kids being shouted at and spit at and just sort of trying to go to school, trying to get an education, there's a lot of public outcry and public sympathy throughout the country being like, this is absurd. So Eisenhower will finally take a stand. He dispatches 1,000 fully equipped paratroopers from the U.S. military to surround the school and escort the students to class. Those soldiers will remain in Little Rock for months, walking the students from class to class. He is the first president to protect civil rights with military force since Reconstruction. right? No other president has sent down American soldiers to protect African Americans in the South since the end of Reconstruction in 1877. He did it hesitantly, but he definitely did do it. The Citizens Council of Little Rock will continue to protest, right? They pressure the Little Rock School Board into reversing its decision to desegregate the public schools. And in August of 1958, the school board ends up canceling the entire 1958-1959 school year for its 3 high schools rather than integrate them. So with all this pressure, rather than allow the schools to just integrate, the town of Little Rock actually shuts down all 3 of its schools and just refuses to have school. So in order to attend high school, all students would have to be shipped out to schools outside of town to try to find somewhere. 1 year later, after additional federal court rulings, the Little Rock Chamber of Commerce finally pressures the school board into reopening the school system, and so by fall of 1959, the Little Rock Public Schools have reopened as an integrated school system. So we see even after federal involvement, right, there's still so much resistance to what's going on. And for many people, this level of resistance, people are scared that integration will mean the end of the world as they know it, and so ingrained in society at this time that people completely overreact in such a huge way. So we will continue to look at the civil rights movement as we go forward, but these are several of the major victories that really sort of get the classic things that we think of when we think of the civil rights, like the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech and some of the legislation passed through in the early 1960s. But this really paves the way for that. So that's the start of the civil rights movement. Now, what we're going to move into now is post-war American culture. Now, again, I want the backdrop to all of this to be this intense fear of nuclear war, right? Like we've talked about. People are terrified that they're going to get blown up. And, that's going to lead into sort of this era, partially into this era of conformity. Let's do what the government says. Let's pay attention. Let's, anything that's out of the ordinary is really going to be looked at. People are going to look down on that because they're worried about what it means. Does that mean that there's a communist attack? Because someone's different than me, does that mean that they're commies? I don't know. And so people are really fearful because of that. But we also have the very classic 1950s. So we'll talk about that. In the 1950s, we see something called Levittowns rise, and this is going to sort of set a trend. So after the war, there's a housing shortage. We have all these young men returning from war. They want to settle down and get married. And because of the low interest loans that were available through the GI Bill, there were more people able to and more people ready to buy houses. And this helps create a housing shortage because people are buying up all the houses. So in order to fill that gap, we create something called Levittowns. Now, these are cheap houses. These are entire communities with a single type of housing plan. They are mass-produced in an assembly line fashion, right? So you're making hundreds of houses that look exactly the same, but that means you can mass-produce every single aspect of that. Oftentimes they're using non-union workers that are getting paid way under what they should be getting paid, but it's all the standardized measurement. And so they're able to mass-produce and therefore cheaply sell these houses, right? So the houses are very cheap, which means everyone's going to be able to buy them. Now, Levitt, the creator of these Levittowns, only wanted to sell them to white families, basically, and no single mothers included in that. So he wouldn't sell to Jews, to African Americans, really to people of any other race, or to single mothers. And that's really going to help add to the conformity and the sameness of the suburbs, right? If he's only choosing to sell to one type of family, it's a lot easier for that family to all be similarly and sort of like-minded. Now, this is going to be, this sort of leads into the development of segregated cities, right? As we have all these neighborhoods with cheap houses being suddenly available and white families moving into those houses, but no one else being allowed in there, we start to see that entire layout of the cities be segregated differently, right? So we're starting to have all white areas. And then because we have all this, what we call white flight, right? People moving up to suburbia, we see, who's going to be left behind in the cities is going to be people of color. And so we're starting to see this process of segregation. Not legal segregation, right, but de facto segregation. One of the other things that is going to really allow for this to happen is the passage of the Interstate Highway Act in 1956. This creates a bunch of highways essentially so people could live outside of town and commute into the city for work, right? Remember how we talked about cars fundamentally changing American society and culture? This is really playing into that. Because everyone can afford a car, everyone is able to drive on these highways and live outside of the city but work in the city. So that makes this possible. So as a result of these mass-produced houses and viable highway systems, we're going to see the rise of suburbia, right? Everything looking exactly the same. So this is a little poem. It's actually they turned it into a song for the beginning of the show Weeds, if anyone has seen that. But it's just, criticizing the entire sameness, right? Everything is exactly the same, just in one slightly different color. But this just leads into this feeling of conformity as a whole. So who can live in the suburbs, or we've kind of talked about this, but this goes, the policies that are going to allow this to happen goes all the way back into the 1930s. Oh, hi, Bandit. Hi. It goes all the way back into the 1950s. And, I mean, the 1930s, sorry. So with some changes in the FHA, which is the Federal Housing Authority, and the rise of the Great Depression, we're seeing people give out loans differently, and the rules about who can qualify for a loan and what a loan looks like change. And so first it's important to understand how loans work. We've talked about this a little bit. But right, essentially, if you get a loan from a bank, the bank loans you money to buy something, right? Like a house or a car or something. I can't buy a $500,000 house, so I'd ask the bank for a loan for $500,000. And the bank pays the person I'm buying the house from, and then I pay the bank back slowly over like 30 years, right? But if you can't make those payments, if you can't pay back that money that they loaned you, the bank will take your property. So that's what, having your house seized or your car seized is, right? So for many people, there's a lot of hesitation around handing out loans to people who are trying to buy houses in, not great areas or whatever. They want to make sure that you are a good investment. So in 1934, the Federal Housing Act, with the Federal Housing Act, the government begins attempting to encourage home ownership. They want people to buy houses because buying houses is good for the economy. Right? This is during the Great Depression. If people start buying houses, they're investing money in the economy and all of that. But the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority manuals, recommend that loan officers, the people who decide whether or not you qualify for a loan, should avoid racial mixing in areas. So they're encouraged to make sure that neighborhoods consist solely of one race. They're worried about all of the, sort of hecticness and craziness and tension that mixed neighborhoods would create. But essentially, they're segregating neighborhoods because of this. So this means that a loan officer is very unlikely to give a person of color a loan to buy a house in a neighborhood that was predominantly white or a nicer neighborhood. So again, it's sort of self-segregating. In order to deal with all of these sort of manuals, what banks start doing is they begin sectionalizing maps. This means they draw red lines around certain areas and certain neighborhoods that are not considered to be financially viable to back loans. And so if you live in one of these areas, it's hard to move out, one of the red line districts, because you can't get a loan to move to a nicer neighborhood. And this is what we call redlining. So lining areas of the map differently and saying who can sort of live where, and dividing that up. Now, this, again, all is going to lead, Bandit, careful, into self-segregated cities, right? Or into not necessarily self-segregated, but de facto segregation, because certain people are allowed to buy and live in one area and other people are not. And this is going to lead to this big division that we see, right? People always say, well, if you live in a bad area, why don't you just move out? Well, I mean, one, it's expensive, but two, for many years, when it was cheap, when it was possible to make that move, you were not allowed to. You could not receive a loan to move into a new neighborhood, right? You were forbidden from doing so. And so that's how we see all white neighborhoods outside of the city and all neighborhoods of color inside of the city, which of course, when we're looking at
The federal government then giving grants and giving money to different areas. The areas that they're going to focus on making nicer are the white areas, and people are going to not care as much about the areas that are predominantly filled with people of color. And so those areas slowly start going downhill, whereas the white areas start getting nicer and nicer. And then this is how we see the split between the ghetto, as we'll call it, and suburbia. This is just sort of to give you an image. This is a map of Los Angeles in which they redlined the different districts. Right, so you can just see the layout of the city. Each different color is a different area for where different people should be, or different sort of qualities of neighborhoods, and sort of that will dictate where you can and cannot sell things to. Now, switching over to culture a little bit. Just like this is another major similarity with the 1920s after World War I. So the 1950s after World War II, we're going to see the rise of a brand new medium and a way for people to communicate and a way for people to get entertained. And this is the rise of television. So the 1920s had radio, right, which fundamentally changed everything. The 50s have television. And it becomes this family activity, right? It will begin to define American culture. We will start seeing new television shows that everyone watches every night. We have the Ed Sullivan Show, which is a Sunday night variety show that featured fresh talent and fresh entertainment. We also have shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver. These TV shows, like most others, generally had the theme of mom is a housewife, dad works a pressure-free white-collar job and comes home, happy and not stressed out at the end of every day, and the kids are very well adjusted to life and witty and funny. And in these shows, married women would hardly ever work, but single women sometimes would work for fun until they, found a husband. There is more money spent making commercials than on the shows themselves. So in the 1950s, we have about 11,000 hours of students getting educated in the classroom, right, all the way through high school. And kids would spend 11,000 hours in the classroom and spend 15,000 hours in front of the TV. So because of the rise of the TV, movies will begin losing patronage. People will stop going out to the theater, and so movies need to find a way to sort of compensate for that. And they're going to develop new social activities. So this is where we'll see things like the rise of the drive-in, being able to take your car and your date to go see a film projected on the big screen, and sort of creating these bigger budget spectacles to get people back. So it changes Hollywood as well. I'd highly recommend, if you have a chance, to just search on YouTube things like Leave It to Beaver or The Ed Sullivan Show. There's a bunch of clips online just so you can get a sense of what this looks like and what sort of, family relationships they have. Okay, so in terms of post-war economics, we're going to see the rise, of course, in consumerism. So this will be accompanied by things like the rise of advertising, right? So we see this husband presenting to his wife the ideal gift for all occasions. She's saying, "Oh, darling, how lovely. I just longed for a Fowler's Vacula bottling outfit for years. Right? Thank you so much for giving me this thing so I can spend more time in the kitchen. That's what I've dreamed of forever." So with television, with advertisement, not only are we going to see print, advertisements in print and newspapers and in magazines, but we're starting to see advertisements in television. And television really creates this culture of images, right? This consumer culture. Just like at the turn of the century and in the 1920s, we have this feeling of yearning for what we do not have and wanting to have all the things we need, right? So we take our identities from what we own and what we can purchase rather than who we are and how we interact with others. Hi, Stella. Hi, sweet girl. Bandit, no. Good boy, good boy. You guys just have to be quiet in here. Sorry. So all these advertisements are new ways to sell products, right? New ways to convince you to buy things. The economic growth after the war is going to begin to allow people to buy the things that we need, even though there's fear surrounding it, because we do remember the Great Depression. But we don't have a huge economic downturn when the war ends, largely because we're going to start fighting the Cold War, which means we're going to maintain production levels, right? Because we jump straight into the Cold War, we need to keep making weapons and make sure that, Russia doesn't get too ahead of us. And so those production levels remain really high. And so people will, as soon as they feel comfortable, like, oh, we're not actually going to go into a recession, people will begin spending. Additionally, people had been saving and spending less because they were told to buy less stuff because we needed to conserve for the war effort. So people actually have some savings left over from the 1940s, which they will be able to invest as well, right? So when the 50s come around and all of a sudden there's stuff to buy, people have money saved up. Bandit, come here. Come here. I know you want to play. Just come over here. Shh. Quiet. Quiet time. Quiet time. Okay. So we can see this too, right, in all of these images and whatnot. The 1950s is very much marked by this idea of standardization and uniformity, right? What is the sameness a result of? Well, there's a lot of things, right? Many people now are second and third generation Americans, which means they have moved a little bit away from their immigrant heritage. So there's even more of the sense of Americanness rather than identifying with your cultural heritage, right? So more and more people, rather than saying I'm Italian but I live in America, or I'm Italian American, are just saying I'm American, right? I have that heritage, but really I'm an American. And then television is also giving this common shared visual experience. And finally, people even have shared, living patterns as a result of this move to suburbia. Hey. Shh. Hey, come here. Come here. Good girl, Stella. Good girl. Culture begins focusing on returning to a traditional way of life. But of course, this is ironic because they're making something completely new. But it's this idea of wanting to go back to the man and the woman and the nuclear family and worrying about all of that. So we're really seeing, white picket fences and, suburbia and everything needing to be perfect and having that idea of this perfect little family unit and all of this being exactly the same, right? That being said, we are going to see the rise of sort of a counterculture. So first off, which is sort of the more tame version, is rock and roll. So this is sort of like the teenage culture, right? Elvis is going to become like, the guy who's the teenage heartthrob and is going to fulfill this place. And a lot of this teenage culture of the 50s comes out of being raised in the affluence and consumerism of the era, very much in contrast to their parents or grandparents who, may have grown up in the Depression and war era, right, with nothing. And so we see this, again, sharp generational divide between the kids of the 1950s and between their parents who had grown up during the Great Depression. Elvis Presley will come to prominence in 1955. Presley was raised in rural Mississippi. He had been surrounded by country singers, gospel singers, blues singers, and his music wasn't necessarily unique, meaning he wasn't the only one doing it, but he had the face and the persona and in order to become sort of the lead in all of this change. And he was white. Right, so a lot of his inspiration was taken from a guy named Little Richard, who's up there too, who's doing a lot of sort of similar type of music. But Presley's handsome and he's young and he's white, and so he's going to become sort of the face of rock and roll. And he's got these new moves, which is considered a little bit scandalous, right? But we see really, the rise of this new type of music that is seen as very different. Now, there's a big backlash to rock and roll, right? Parents are looking at their kids who are looking at Elvis, and they're like, oh my God, this is so scandalous. Rock and roll is so sexualized. I mean, look at Presley up there shaking his hips. It's so obscene, right? I can't believe that. And you can see, you couple that with the racial tinge, as they would call it. People very much freak out about rock and roll to the point where when Elvis first goes on television, they only film him from the waist up, right? Because he's doing his little hip movement dances, and so they only show him from the waist up, so it doesn't look like he's as ridiculous as he is. So I would also recommend just Google Elvis if you've never seen him play before. Just look up a YouTube clip of him playing, so you can sort of get a sense of what that looks like and what was considered so incredibly scandalous at the time. Now, even more scandalous than sort of this whole rock and roll persona, we are also going to see the rise of the beat counterculture. So the counterculture of the 50s will become known as the beat movement. The beats are writing against and speaking out against oppression, expressing hostility to mainstream culture, sort of criticizing the conformity, the consumerism, the materialism that's all going on. Right? They're an extreme reaction to an extreme society. Okay, guys, too much playing in here. Sorry. Bandit, Stella, out. Go get Dad. Out. Out. Thank you. Sorry. Um, and so, right, they're reacting to what they would call like the suburbia or the Stepford wives or the pod people, right? Everyone who looks exactly the same and are doing the exact same thing. Many of the beats are very much focused on spontaneity, right? What they would say, the pouring forth of your subconscious as a way of taking away the intentionality of art and just letting art flow out of you and just sort of see what comes up. The big hubs of beat culture will be New York, Denver, and San Francisco. And we'll see a lot of common themes that sort of come out of this. Things like spirituality, but not like conforming to traditional religions or organized religions. So elements of Buddhism, elements of spirituality, elements of Christianity, but nothing that's like conformed. They also want to defy categories and labels and push boundaries and, sort of, they're sort of like the original hipsters and not like, like, oh my God, I'm such a cute little hipster, but like this pushback to all of what we've seen recently. So what's the appeal? This culture offers freedom. It offers irresponsibility, refusal to take on that traditional 9 to 5 and do what society tells you to do. It's pushing back against the boundaries of this conformity. And two of our most well-known writers will absolutely exemplify this. So the first is Jack Kerouac. He's most well known for On the Road, but he writes a whole variety of books. And On the Road is written in 1951, but published in 1957 and 58. And it's based on a cross-country journey that he had taken. It's very largely autobiographical, although he changes the names and whatnot. So Kerouac wrote himself as someone called Sal Paradise, and his closest friend at the time was Dean Moriarty, and in the book he's called Neal Cassady. And we see both William S. Burroughs, who writes a book called Naked Lunch, which is kind of crazy, and then Allen Ginsberg will make appearances. And it's very much about pushing all these boundaries. They're just hanging out in a car, doing nothing that they're supposed to be doing, right? Drinking, drug use, they're having sex, right? They're doing all these things that society at the time is telling you not to do. And it's just that freedom and refusal to accept responsibilities. Now, Ginsberg is going to write, he's going to be one of the most influential writers of the era, and he writes this very epic poem called Howl. Howl will become the center of an obscenity trial in 1957. It depicts both heterosexual and homosexual sex in the poem, talks about drug use and whatnot, but ultimately the judge will rule on the side of freedom of speech and allow the poem to exist, saying that it's not obscene, thankfully. But Ginsberg will be put sort of in the celebrity spotlight because of this. He rejects this sort of celebrityhood. He hates the idea of being an icon, and he eventually will become incredibly disillusioned with the beat movement later in life, and ultimately he ends up dying from complications of alcoholism. So all of this is seen as sort of this very like gritty, cool, awesome stuff, but there is a lot of drug use and there's a lot of alcoholism that comes with it and a lot of sort of like tormented souls. But the beat movement, everything that takes place here is going to become the foundation and the basis, or sort of that counterculture and pushing back will develop into the hippie movement and will develop into the counterculture of the 1960s. So they really were the ones who started that whole pushback. Okay, so good. If you want to get more of a sense of this, there's a couple really good films you can watch, or TV shows, or sort of just look up some stuff online. So I would encourage you to look up clips of, I Love Lucy or Leave It to Beaver or something like that to get that sense of conformity. There's also a really great film called Pleasantville, with Reese Witherspoon and Jake Gyllenhaal, which I would have showed in class if we had time, but it shows this jump. They're basically jumped back into this 1950s television show, but it's a really good commentary on sort of what that looks like and then how they affect the show and change it, and talk about race relations. But just look up a preview. It's really good and worth watching. You can also watch things like Mona Lisa's Smile, which will help you sort of tackle all this conformity and even what it looks like for wealthy, privileged women who are able to get an education and what the social expectations are. Then look at music, right? Again, YouTube is great. They have so much of this. And then, you can look up Howl or some of Allen Ginsberg's stuff if you want to as well. If anyone has seen the TV show Mad Men or feels like starting that too, that's another great one, looking at the advertising industry and looking at the consumerism as a whole. Okay, thanks guys. Sorry about my dogs. I hope you all have a great weekend.